biggest mistake by mocking him like this. He showed no mercy to me later.
You know how they say you never know what you have till you lose it? Well, that saying is just so true. I lost everything. Everything I had on a platter of gold, all because I made a very bad decision, or, say, I made a bad-looking decision in the form of a man. Just one thing could ruin everything you've ever worked for. One thing, just one desire, and poof, your whole life is all gone. Hello, Reddit. My name is Adele, and I'm 32 years old. I was married to an amazing person, Joe. He was everything a woman could ever want. But despite that, my selfish desires still found their way into my beautiful happiness and struck, and now I'm just a single, scared, and empty woman who became a slave to her desires. Joe had always been in my life right from birth, but at a distance. I lived in a small town when I was younger with my family and 3 younger siblings, 2 girls and 1 boy excluding me. When I said small town, I meant so small that everyone knew everyone, and everyone was literally in each other's business, but we all related as one big, happy family. I grew up, of course, under the watchful gaze of my family, including the whole town, might I add. I attended one of the 2 schools in the community and was a good girl. I was the typical nerd with glasses on, skinny, head stuck in books, and always found in the library type, whereas Joe was the everyone's favorite type. He was the cute boy growing up, and then the handsome young guy that every girl had a crush on in class, including me. But Joe was 2 years older and ahead of me in class, so I was the junior, always daydreaming and scribing his name on notes without him knowing. He had lots of girls around, so there was no way I could even compete with the classy girls. Joe left for college later on, and I was sad but moved on pretty quickly. Then, in my final year in high school, I had a massive growth. From the thin, shapeless nerd to a full-bloomed, curvy body, I became the everyone wants to date type. I was happy with my growth, so I ditched the glasses, got lenses, and changed my clothes, because they obviously didn't fit my new body and style. I went to college, and at the end of my first year, I came back home with some friends of mine. Summer was usually extremely hot back home, so it was usually a good idea to swim as much as you could to help reduce the heat on your skin. And per usual, my friends and I had decided to go to the beach and go swimming that day to cool off. We got there, and I had excused myself to go get drinks for the girls and me when I bumped into a lean, muscular frame. Looking up to apologize, I realized that person was Joe. I was pleased to see him, and we exchanged contacts, and from then on, we picked things up. Joe finished earlier than I did from school, but waited till I was done to ask me to marry him. We got married in our hometown, and then went back to the city to start our lives. The first 3 years of being married were amazing. Joe had insisted I be a housewife, so I could take care of our kids properly when they do come, and I agreed. My friends were jealous of me, and I enjoyed it because they whined about their own work, and I was glad I didn't have to go through that. Until I grew bored. In the 4th year of our marriage, Joe was promoted, and though I was happy for him, the job description came with traveling for work. Joe started traveling a lot, leaving me at home for weeks most times, sometimes days, and I wasn't happy with that. But I couldn't complain too much because of the money I was squandering on expensive jewelry and clothes. And then again, he made up for it when he was back home and would take me out on fun dates. But then, when he wasn't around, all I did was hang out with my friends, which was only on weekends as they had work to do. And when we did hang out, all they discussed was how stressful work was and how envious they were of me not working. At that point, I wasn't happy they envied me again. I was becoming too bored with almost nothing to do except wait eagerly for Joe or my friends to be around. I took up a hobby of planting a garden, but I was hopeless at it, and within 2 weeks, all the flowers were dead. I didn't enjoy sports that much, so taking it up as a hobby was not an option. I started reading books, both educational and non-educational, but soon enough I got bored again. I took it up with Joe and insisted on working, but Joe wouldn't agree. Eventually, when he saw how unhappy I was, he suggested I study again, since I had mentioned it one time when we were dating that I'd like to have 2 degrees. I welcomed the idea with open arms and became busy searching for a new college and what course of study I wanted to go for. I eventually got accepted into a college that was both close to my home and the schedules were flexible. I remember I had been so happy, I called Joe, but his phone went straight to voicemail, which meant he was busy at work. Then I called my friends to inform them, but none of them were picking up either. I had only myself to celebrate with, so I ordered some food, brought out one of our finest wines. Joe was a wine lover, so we always had stacks of them at home, and drank a whole bottle. Believe me, I didn't ever try that again because the next day wasn't so good as my head tingled with any little noise I heard, so I was in bed all day that day. I started college again, excited for a new adventure. I made a couple of friends and hung out with them most times. It was not easy starting college again because I was obviously older than most of them, but they weren't freaked by it. I had a round oval face which made me look younger than I was at age 26. But it didn't matter as it helped me get the same treatment as others did. Well, that was where I met Max. Max was the popular kid in class, and every girl's dream, just like Joe was. He was quite attractive with his easy smiles that gave away his one-sided dimple and his deep brown eyes that flashed every time he grinned. He was charming and also smart. I knew he was trouble, and I was happy we weren't talking then, because he definitely caught my attention. But I wasn't a young girl just starting life anymore. I was married happily to Joe. Well, as fate would have it, he was friends with a friend of mine. So we had a mutual friend, and they had a study group that they read together for exams, and I sure wasn't surprised when I heard Max was also a part of the study group. We started studying together, and I found myself drawn to him. At first I tried to brush it off, thinking I was just being friendly, but deep down, I knew I was attracted to him, and he made sure I knew that he knew I was attracted to him if his cocky grins were anything to go by whenever he came near me. I tried avoiding him. Believe me, I tried so hard. But how could you fight the temptation that's always right in your space? One fateful night, Max invited me to a party, and I accepted, despite knowing Joe wouldn't approve. But he was traveling per usual, so I made a verdict that what he didn't know couldn't hurt. I was excited when he had invited me out because it was the weekend, and I was already dreading staying at home alone, bored and without nothing to do again. So when he extended the invite to me, I jumped at the chance, even though I had some doubts if I was doing the right thing. But then I pushed it aside and went anyway. I wore a dark gray dress that's perfect for a night out. It was made of a comfortable, stretchy material that hugged my curves in all the right places. The dress was sleeveless and showed off my toned arms and had a subtle high-low hem that added a touch of sass. The neckline was rounded and soft, framing my face without revealing too much. I paired the dress with a pair of black ankle boots that added a bit of edge and height. My hair was let down, and I got a few loose waves framing my face. I kept my makeup simple, with a bold lip color that added a pop of color to my overall look. I felt confident and sexy, but still effortlessly cool. I loved that this dress made me feel like I was dressed up without trying too hard. The dress was a great example of a casual night party look that still catches the eye. The dark color, sleeveless design, and high-low hem all contribute to a flattering feminine silhouette. The stretchy material and comfortable boots made it perfect for a night of dancing and fun. The subtle makeup and loose hair add to the effortless, I'm not trying too hard vibe. Overall, this dress was perfect for a woman, me, who wanted to look great and have fun without looking like she's trying too hard to impress. Even though it was clear as day I was definitely trying to impress. Someone in particular. Someone that was Max. Funnily, Joe had gotten me that dress because, in his words, he wanted me to dress beautifully for him on our next date, so I hadn't even worn it before. But I was clearly trying to impress Max, and I definitely got what I wanted. Max noticed me, all right. In fact, I didn't spend any time all through the party outside his presence. We had a few drinks, danced, and laughed together. I had so much fun that night. It felt like a release, a break from the monotony of my life. I was happy, and when Max had been summoned by a friend of his, I was feeling so giddy that I knew I had to exploit the energy. So I was out dancing again for maybe the 6th or 7th time. I don't know, I lost count because of how much fun I was having, and I remembered that someone had come up behind me and was dancing with me. Maybe because of the drinks I already had and was already tipsy. Maybe that was why I continued dancing seductively, acting like a female in heat. By then, the song had turned slow, and the person turned me around, and it was Max. I had blushed deeply and apologized for my behavior, and he had waved it off, saying he enjoyed dancing with me. We continued dancing, and I don't know, maybe I should blame the attraction I already had towards him, or the drinks I had, because when Max had leaned forward and kissed me on the lips, I behaved wantonly and just wrapped my hands around his shoulder, kissing him back without hesitation. The guilt consumed me the next morning. I knew I had betrayed Joe's trust, and the weight of my actions crushed me. But I knew at that moment, even if I wasn't drunk, I wouldn't have done things differently, and that alarmed me. I was getting involved with someone that wasn't even my husband. I wondered what Joe would think if I told him, but I decided to keep mute about it, deciding that I had to tell Max it couldn't happen again because I was married and I loved my husband. It was harder than I thought, though, because every time I saw him, I was reminded of the kiss we shared, and my heart rate increased rapidly. Well, you know what they say, that what you love could kill you. I knew he was definitely not good for my heart, but I continued anyway, foolishly. It was later that week I got to have a private moment alone with Max. We had finished up our studying, and that day we had used Max's home for it because our usual spot was booked for the whole week, and Max offered for us to use his place. So when we were done, I had offered to stay back and help him clean. He didn't object, and neither did the others. When they had all gone, I helped him clean, and afterward asked to speak with him. I told him how whatever had happened last weekend couldn't happen again, and made up excuses about how much older than him I was, and that I was married and I loved my husband. Maybe it was because my mouth was speaking, and my heart wasn't following my line of speech. And Max, too, probably saw that because he just dragged me to himself and kissed me hard on the lips. I tried to push him away, but there's only so much temptation a girl could run away from, and I gave in, too easily. And just like that, we had sex. Mind-blowing one, might I add. It was nothing compared to what Joe and I had. Maybe because Max was younger and I clearly wasn't thinking right, but I had sex with him quite all right, regardless of whatever the reason might have been. After that, I had put on my clothes without a word to him and rushed out. I hurried home, discarded my clothes like hot coals, as if they were the ones who caused me to sin, took a hot shower, and then lay on my bed to process what had happened. But I didn't even have words to describe how I felt. It was guilt and desire all in one. I had just cheated on my husband, and yet I was still dreaming of Max and how he touched me. It was bizarre. I even had to skip school for a week, and when my friends called to check up on me, I came up with excuses that I was sick. Joe came home later that week and, as usual, tried to make up for leaving home for so long. But I wasn't excited by it. I was feeling guilty and at the same time giddy about what I had done. In fact, when Joe tried to touch me, I was imagining it to be Max, so I made him stop, making excuses of being stressed out by school. Of course, my ever-understanding Joe bought the lie hook, line, and sinker and just cuddled me. Once he was asleep, I lay there in his arms thinking about Max. When I went back to school, Max pursued me actively, saying he couldn't help how he felt. I was torn between my love for Joe and this new, exciting connection with Max. Joe's travels became more frequent, and I found myself seeking comfort in Max's company. And very soon, we were, more like I became, addicted to Max. I looked forward to spending time with him, so I would look for different reasons to do just that. Even when Joe was around, and I couldn't spend time with Max as I would love, I'd make up excuses about schoolwork that needed urgent attention and would go over to Max's place. Joe was like ice cream itself, but Max was the extra toppings on it. I felt guilty, especially because I was cheating on Joe, but at that point, my guilt didn't even matter to me, as I was already far too into it to stop. The second sin I committed aside from cheating on Joe was getting pregnant. Don't get me wrong, it was not the pregnancy that was the issue. It was what I did afterward that was. My period had been late, and I was feeling really funny, especially in the mornings, so I bought some pregnancy tests, and it came out positive. I was conflicted as to who exactly I was pregnant for, so I went to the hospital to get tested, and it turned out I was pregnant for 6 weeks already. Calculating back, I realized the baby would belong to Joe. He had been home for that week throughout, and I had no excuse to make to go see Max so as not to rouse Joe's suspicion. I stayed home that week until Joe was safely out of town before I went back into the arms of my lover. So the baby definitely had to belong to Joe. I was conflicted. I didn't know what I wanted. When I had been so bored earlier in our marriage, I had hoped so much for a baby, so at least I could get my hands full with its presence. But getting pregnant then was bad timing, especially as there were my studies to finish up and then Max. Surprisingly, at that moment, I wasn't even considering Joe's feelings. I knew he had always wanted a child, but he didn't say because he didn't want to pressure me. I was thinking only of what I wanted, the freedom I was supposedly enjoying with Max, and I didn't want to risk it. I told Max about the baby first, and, as expected, he wasn't happy. He convinced me to abort the baby, and I did. Well, he didn't exactly tell me directly what I should do, but he did do enough to convince me that having a baby at that time meant jeopardizing our relationship. I know, I was stupid and foolish for making such a decision, but at that time I wasn't even clearly thinking. The mistake I made then was that I had the abortion at the clinic where Joe and I used. I went over to Max's place to recuperate for some days, and would have been longer if Joe hadn't called to ask where I was. Apparently, he finished working earlier than usual and decided to come home to his beautiful wife. His words. I lied that I was with a friend and we were having girl time, but when he offered to pick me up when I was done, I refused and told him I would come home immediately. I literally rushed home, and when I did get home, I got the surprise of my life when I saw Joe come out of our bathroom holding the pregnancy kit I had used before going to the hospital that day. I didn't dispose of it. Joe was so happy and hugged and kissed me several times with tears in his eyes that I couldn't even say anything to ruin that moment for him. He was saying then that how it was no wonder I was asking when he was coming home and how I told him I couldn't wait to see him. I was texting for a different reason, but Joe wanted us to go to the hospital together to test if the baby was growing okay, and I told him I had already gone and everything was perfect, which wasn't technically a lie as I did go, but went again afterward for a different reason, but he obviously didn't know that then. I continued with the pretense for a month as Joe refused to travel for any work issues, even if I told him to go. The most he was gone for was a day, and it was frustrating pretending to be delicate when you're not. I had to rush to the bathroom every morning, remembering to lock the bathroom door with the excuse of I didn't want him to see me puking and pretend to puke and flush. Then coming out to the same crackers. I didn't like them one bit, but I had to keep up the act if I didn't want to break Joe's heart. He was so obsessed with keeping me healthy for the baby's sake that I began to eat healthy. Who likes eating healthy at all? But then he ensured my cravings were satisfied once a day. That was the only good part. I didn't even get to see Max as often as I would have liked, and it made me more irritable. So at the end of the first month of staying at home nearly every day with me, he had to go for an emergency trip and was going to be back the next day. I went over to Max's place and I explained how frustrating it was staying home and pretending to still be pregnant and asked for suggestions on how to end the whole charade. Because I knew soon enough, when my tummy didn't expand in size, Joe would begin to suspect me because I was quite chubby, and it was impossible not to be bloated when pregnant. Joe and I had even joked about it earlier on in our marriage. Max suggested I miscarry in a dramatic way, because if I just told him I miscarried just like that, it would make him suspect me. We agreed on me paying someone to do a hit-and-run job on me, so in that process I would actually miscarry the baby. It was an extreme action, but I had to because Joe wasn't exactly an easy man to convince, except he saw evidence for himself. I gave Max money to pay the driver, and we set the whole thing. The timing, arrival, and calling 911 services. I was anxious, and I was right to be because the driver hit me so hard. I thought I had died and gone to heaven or maybe hell. Most definitely hell because my sins were grievous. I lost consciousness for the whole of 5 hours, so I was told. And when I woke up, I was surprised to see Joe beside my bed holding my hand. I just started crying because I couldn't believe I could have lost my life over something I paid someone for. Joe probably thought I was crying for the loss of the baby when he told me that the baby was gone, because he just held my hands tight, pain evident on his face, and didn't say anything. Apparently, Max had brought me in and paid a nurse off to tell Joe I lost a baby. After that incident, Joe's attitude changed towards me. He was still caring, but a bit rigid. I didn't even know what was wrong. I knew that he hadn't found out about my affair, but it bothered me seeing him like that. Whenever I asked, he would just wave it off as work problems that I didn't need to bother about, but instinctively, I knew that wasn't all there was to it. I thought maybe the loss of the baby had affected him that much, and I regretted at that moment why I aborted the baby. I didn't stop seeing Max, though. I couldn't. He was an addiction that you know is bad but couldn't do without. Like a craving, especially a pregnant woman's cravings. Sorry, I shouldn't have used that analogy because I obviously ruined the chances of that happening for me. But then I couldn't help my feelings when I was with Max. I still loved my husband, but that didn't stop my insane strong desires to be with Max. Well, that was until everything came crashing down. Everything that I have ever known and loved just dispersed like they never existed, and I was left with the memories of what could have been. With a hidden camera, he, Joe, overheard me mocking him with my lover, and his response changed everything. Let me explain how it all happened. Joe wasn't traveling as frequently as he did again, and it made seeing Max all the more difficult. So that day, I wasn't in the best of moods, and Joe wasn't helping as he mostly just decided to stay in his study for hours working instead of traveling as he did before, and it made me angry and frustrated. By the time it was evening, I was so frustrated and lonely that I had picked up my bag and, without informing him, left the house to go see Max. And as usual, I left Max's place later in the night happy and feeling less lonely. I knew I was going to have to work something up to tell Joe because I even switched off my phone so he wouldn't reach me. When I got to the house, it was dark, and I fumbled for my keys and knew that Joe might have probably gone to bed, which was definitely unusual because Joe normally wouldn't sleep out of worry that he didn't know where I was. But given his new character these days, it was possible. It bothered me, but I just shrugged it off and eventually opened the door, reached for the light switch, and flipped it, and immediately, light flooded the room. My heart was in my throat the next second when I saw Joe on the cushion sitting in the dark, his head between his hands that rested on his knees. I had cleared my throat and moved towards him, my heart still racing, and asked him what he was doing sitting in the dark. But he didn't respond, only lifted his head slowly and looked at me. His eyes, I remember vividly, were red and reflected the pain he felt, and I stood there speechless, just staring at his eyes. I didn't realize he had a small chip in his hand until he pressed it, and the sound of my laughter filled the room. It was me and Max talking about Joe. Max had been mocking Joe and referring to him as a man who couldn't even make a woman happy, a beautiful one at that, and I had laughed at that, hugging him to myself and then kissing him. Soon enough, my moans filled the room from the recorder, and it was like my body received the strength it needed, and I tried to snatch it out of his hands, but he just stood up and moved away from me. I tried to catch his hand again with the I can explain theory, but he snatched his hand out of my grip like I disgusted him, and then told me he knew everything I had been doing. Apparently, the day I had the accident, he had been called, and he had rushed down to see me only to be informed by a fidgeting nurse that I had lost the baby, and he was suspicious and went to see the doctor. There he was told that I had been pregnant truly, but had had an abortion done 2 days after finding out, and had lied that my husband consented to it. He had a private investigator follow me and report all my movements to him. So, as he wanted to file for a divorce and knowing that I'd probably be given his money, he wanted evidence that I was cheating on him so I would get nothing from him, and he had planted the camera in my bag without me knowing, patiently waiting for when I'd step out and step into my lover's arms. And I stepped willingly into that trap. There was no denying what I had done. There was evidence against me already, and I know saying sorry wouldn't cut it, but I still tried. I got on my knees and pleaded for forgiveness, but he just took one look at me on the floor and ignored me totally, leaving me on the floor there to cry my heart out. I didn't sleep through the night. I was there pondering on how much I had come to lose already, and by morning Joe had freshened up and got ready to leave the house. He told me he would be traveling but returning that same day, and wanted to see any trace of me in the house gone, and the only way he would contact me was through his lawyer to get the divorce papers across to me. My life is ruined. I cannot bear the thought of losing Joe. I now realize that life without Joe was never going to be the same, and not even the thought of Max helped me get rid of the feeling of dread I had. Please help me. Any advice of any sort on what to do to get back Joe? I cannot lose him. Please help me. I love him very much. I know what I've done to him was despicable, but please help me. Update. Hey Reddit, it's Adele here. It's been a while since I last posted, and I know what I did was wrong. but you are focused more on just blaming me. I blamed myself already, but you people made me hate myself more. It's been 3 months now. I'm officially divorced and also penniless. Joe left me nothing as he promised. Though I know I deserved nothing, as thinking back, I realized I never added anything to his life. I just spent his money, sat around, and did nothing useful for him. He tried all his possible best to make up for everything he was lacking, but I never tried on my own part. I didn't see all his efforts. All I saw was my own selfishness and how to just satisfy my desires. I didn't do anything to make our lives better. Instead, I destroyed the one thing we shared. No, actually the 2 most important things we should have shared: love and our child. Almost absently, I would rub my stomach and imagine a baby still there. Maybe then Joe wouldn't have cut me off so brutally. Maybe I'd have a chance to win him back and make up for everything I've done. Funny how hard Joe had tried to make our marriage work by offering that I travel with him, but I refused, making excuses that I'd be bored while he worked. I wish now so badly that I had taken him up on the offer. At least I would have explored different parts of the world, and it would have made up for the loneliness instead of what I eventually did. For those people asking about Max, turns out that Max was, after all, only after the money I gave him. Yes, he was a gold digger who left me when he realized I had nothing left. He even went around telling people that I, a married woman, seduced him, and now I've lost them both. My husband when he realized I was cheating, and him when he realized how I had been sleeping around. A big lie, as he was the only one I was having an affair with. But everyone bought his story hook, line, and sinker, and avoided me, even the friends I thought I had. I had to quit school eventually because I had no money to pay for necessities. My parents refused to speak to me and forbade my siblings from doing the same. They wanted nothing to do with a daughter who would treat her husband that way. I can't even blame them. I ruined their reputation in that small town of ours when news of my failed marriage got across to them. So I had to sell most of my expensive jewelry, shoes, and clothes to be able to feed and get a very small apartment to stay in. The apartment was leaking, and I could hear different movements, especially at night because it was badly soundproofed. But at the moment, I had no choice but to bear with it. Seeking a job with my previous degree sounded like a long-time plan, which I didn't need because that meant spending more money on going to places for interviews, so I just got 2 part-time jobs instead. One as a waitress in a minibar, and the other as a shop attendant. I rotated my shifts and worked tirelessly so that when I had time to sleep, I would do so effortlessly, but it didn't even happen that way. You know when your body is so tired and all it needs is rest, but your mind is actively awake and pondering on things you could have done better, and life would have been so much better if you hadn't done things the way you did them. I would sit and stare into the dark at night and just stay there. The darkness my only comfort. I didn't exactly believe that depression and loneliness went hand in hand until now. They were my companions. I avoided staring at mirrors. In fact, I had none in my home to avoid seeing what was left of me. I was sure I looked skinny and probably had huge eye bags that were like permanent features on me already. Losing Joe made me realize just how badly I hurt him. I still would always remember his eyes. When he had looked at me with such disgust and hatred. Those eyes haunt me every day of my life, and I feel like living on would be very hard. I've become a nobody. Just a matter of existing and taking up space, a dark, empty space. I cannot even forgive myself for killing our love, and most especially our baby. So I know that trying to seek his forgiveness was futile. Now, all I'm left with is to pick up the pieces of my shattered life, wondering how I let my greediness and desire for excitement destroy the perfect love I had with Joe. Trying to even move on had very little success, because the pain of losing him forever is a constant reminder of my mistakes. I really wish I had done things better and not behaved wantonly and sought attention where I wasn't supposed to in the first place. Update. Hey Reddit, this is my very last post here. Just wanted to appreciate y'all for reading my posts. The hate and the backslashing I received were enough to fuel the pain and agony I relive every day, but I'm still thankful for them, and no to every question you might have on your mind. I'm not better. I don't feel like I've done anything to move on, and I'm not trying to. I'm stuck in the past, and I think I'll forever be. I'm a sinner, and I will pay dearly for the sins I've committed against Joe and an innocent child. I will forever curse the day I met Max and all his temptations. I regret every moment now. I feel disgusted that I felt alive and excited about those moments I spent with him. But thinking back then, I didn't know I was digging my own grave, and I wish I had done things better and in a different way. I know Joe is living good now. I'm only able to guess because I see his posts every now and then on social media, and though he never returned any single one of my texts, he made sure I knew he was punishing me by reading them and purposely not replying. I wish that I am part of the life he has now, but I know how impossible that is. So I've accepted my cruel fate that I brought upon myself. Some words of advice? Don't make the same mistakes I did. Thanks and bye. How would you feel if you found out that your husband set you up? I mean, how would you react if you found out that your own husband hired a person to try and seduce you, and you fell for it? Well, yes, my husband hired a model to test my loyalty. I'm not proud of this, but I fell for the trap even though I'm not supposed to, and now my husband is asking for a divorce. Don't blame me yet, please. Let me tell my story first before you judge me. Hello, Reddit. My name is Stella, and I am 34 years old. I worked in a bank as an accountant. I quit after getting married. I've been married for close to 11 years. I met my husband Steven when I was 22, and we dated for a year before we got married. When I was a young child growing up, I saw firsthand what jealousy could do to a person, really. My mother was always so jealous whenever she thought my dad was cheating. You see, my dad was a very outgoing person. He was that cool dude that everyone wanted to relate with, and I even heard stories from my aunt, my father's sister, when I went to live with her eventually, that my dad was the most popular kid in school. When he was in college, too, he was still popular, and girls flocked around him a lot, even though he paid little attention to them. I mean, a national team basketball player would be like that, definitely. He had met my mother back in college, and she had always wanted him and managed to weave her way into his life. She got him drunk, had sex with him, and then she got pregnant, and my dad had no choice but to marry her. I was the product of the seduction game my mother played, so I guess because she didn't exactly win his heart, even though my father never did anything to make her think she wasn't good enough for him. I mean, I saw how my father would try to please her with gifts and even take us on family vacations, especially when he wasn't working. He was a basketball coach. My mother was still never satisfied and was always anxious he was going to cheat on her, or even that he had already cheated on her. She had no time for me. Even when she had to watch me if my aunt wasn't around to do that, she would start to tell me how she was sure that wherever my dad was, he was seeing another woman. She would bite her nails and pace around the house. When my dad decided her usual habits were affecting me, he sent me off to live with his mother, my grandmother, in another city. But I guess the damage had already been done, and I never even knew myself that I was clearly affected by my mom's behavior. Years of living with my grandmother were bliss. I didn't have to watch my mother get anxious because they usually eventually made me nervous. One time, my dad requested I come home when I was in the final year of high school. I was surprised because my father just always came to visit me at my grandma's place, not send for me. So I went purely out of curiosity, and I was told my mother had passed on. My father told me she was sick, and her body couldn't cope with the illness, and she died. Instead of feeling sad and crying, I felt anger. I had hoped she would live, and eventually, when I was old enough, I would be able to help her. I wanted to become a psychiatrist because of her, so I was working very hard in school to achieve my purpose. But then she died, and my dreams of becoming a psychiatrist died with her. My mother was always so anxious about my father's whereabouts that it took a toll on her physical health. I even heard she started seeing a psychiatrist before she died, but obviously she didn't get any better. I changed my mind about becoming a psychiatrist because I didn't want a patient's death on my hands, so I started to apply to universities for accounting. I got handpicked by several colleges, but because my grandmother was very old and weak, I wanted to stay close to her, so I eventually chose a college close to her home. I made trips to and from school from her place, catching buses. It wasn't easy at first, but I eventually got used to it. It was on my 20th birthday that my dad gifted me my first car. I was very happy because it made my transportation much easier. My grandmother passed on, God rest her soul, when I was in my 3rd year. I cried so hard because I was so used to coming back home to Nana, as I would call her, and telling her all I had learned, the friends I met, and anything that happened in school. She, in turn, told me about the gossip she heard. We had a really sweet relationship, and I was very hurt when I saw her lying peacefully on her bed, without moving or breathing, when I went to give her her morning tea. She had died in her sleep. I couldn't cope with losing Grandma and coming back to that empty house, so my dad eventually suggested moving into another place much closer to school, and so I did. Perhaps because after classes, I've had to rush to make it in time for the buses, because I didn't have enough for taxis, I didn't have time to socialize and meet new friends. So when I moved closer to school, I began to make more friends, going to parties, and I was having fun. It was then that I met Oliver. We met at one of the parties that I was invited to by one of the girls. We met and liked each other, so we eventually started dating. But I realized that Oliver was short-tempered and could do anything whenever he was angry. In fact, he slapped me twice before. The first time was because I was late for our date that evening because I had classes and then had to write an impromptu test. The second was because I hadn't gotten home early enough because I was with my friends, and he believed I was with some guy. I broke things off with him, and it wasn't exactly easy because I had to get a restraining order against him. He would stalk me and start apologizing, and whenever he saw me with another guy that wasn't him, he would be furious and try to beat up the guy. Luckily, they were always stronger than he was, and he ended up being beaten. The last guy wasn't, though, and he put him in the hospital, so I had to get a restraining order against him. I didn't date any other guy until I finished college because I was scared they were going to turn out like Oliver, who eventually had to transfer schools because of his violent temperament. What he did to me spread around school, and everyone started to talk about him, and he couldn't stand it. So when I finished college, I met Simeon, and he was actually the one who got me my present job. Though I worked hard to get where I am now with the job, he was close to the boss in the bank, and he just put in 1 or 2 words for me, and I was hired. Simeon was just obviously the sweetest guy I had ever met. He was very kind and handsome, he took good care of me, and he was just always there for me. But eventually, being sweet and kind wasn't enough to cover his flaws. Simeon was a junkie. He did hard drugs and could barely go a day without them. Whenever he couldn't get his hands on drugs, he became really violent and acted too much like someone possessed until he'd had 1 drag or 2. In fact, the day I found out about it and I tried to hide his drugs, well, let's just say it really wasn't funny because I nearly ended up in the hospital after being chased by him and almost got hit by a car. I tried to get him help, but Simeon just wouldn't accept the help and preferred to stick to his drugs. I had to break up with him because I couldn't cope with his addiction. We couldn't even have sex except he had snuck off to take drugs, especially the ones injected. Back then, before I knew he used drugs as his energy booster for sex, I used to love the long hours of tireless sex, and I nearly got addicted too to having that long sex. When I found out about the energy booster, especially for our sexual life, I was upset because I knew it wasn't that he wasn't satisfied with having little of me, as I thought before, but because the drugs actually made it hard for him to climax. There was one time we were having sex for so long, I almost got fired from the job he helped me secure. He had woken up that morning and went into the bathroom to do drugs, but I hadn't known about it then. And when he came back, he started kissing me and begged for a quick 5 minutes of sex, which eventually turned into 2 hours. When I saw the time, I tried pushing him off, but he was just too strong, and he made sure he got his release before letting me go, which was after another hour, by the way. I got to work really late, and funnily enough, the boss was around. He almost bit my head off and threatened that it had better be the last time unless I wanted to be unemployed. I remember being so angry with Simeon, and when I got home earlier than I usually would, I saw him doing drugs. He clearly wasn't expecting me that soon, as he was shocked to see me and tried to remove the drugs from the table. I was so upset with him that I picked up the drugs and burned them and made him promise never to do it again. Except I didn't know he was already an addict, so eventually, I just had to end things with him. I was still nursing the heartbreak of losing Simeon when I met Steven. At first, I hadn't paid him any attention. I didn't even notice him because he didn't look like someone I would date. Let's just say I had a type. I mean, everyone does, right? I like tall guys with sandy hair, a good body build, and dark eyes as a plus. Stephen was none of that. He was short, even shorter than me. He had brown eyes and dark hair, and he was not fat but also not thin. He was in between and had a protruding stomach. I didn't like his physique at all, and hadn't even noticed him at first. In fact, because I didn't like his physical appearance, I wasn't interested in anything he had to say. We met for the first time when he came back from his work travels at my friend Vivian's place. He is her elder brother. Vivian was my very good friend. We've been friends since the first year of college, and we work at the same bank, so we visited each other on weekends to drink, eat, and gossip about the recent happenings in the office. He, Stephen, had come visiting, bearing gifts for his sister from his travels, and Vivian introduced us. I smiled politely and accepted his handshake, but after that, I just literally stuck to my phone and didn't participate in their conversation, as I felt it was between siblings. Stephen tried to involve me in their conversations, but I would just smile politely and focus again on my phone. Later that week, when Vivian and I had another opportunity to hang out, she told me her brother was interested in me and had been asking about me all week since he saw me at her place. But I brushed off the topic politely. I didn't want to be rude. I did not like his looks, and I was sure Vivian knew that. I've always told her how I liked my men to be. We've always joked about it in school, and would go ahead to rate all the cute boys we saw on campus. Maybe it was because it was her brother, and she obviously didn't want to lie to him that she had asked me when she hadn't. She asked if she could share my contact information with him, and I agreed reluctantly because I didn't want to disappoint Vivian. He started calling and texting me. I found it bothersome and sometimes would purposely ignore his calls and texts, and later come up with some excuse about how busy I was. One weekend, I was planning to spend time with my girl Vivian as usual, but she called to cancel, telling me she had a hot date. I was happy for her because it had been a while since she hung out with someone else other than me, but on the other hand, I was sad, because that meant I had no one to hang out with that weekend, and I was bored out of my mind when I got a text from Stephen. He was asking if I could hang out with him by having lunch with him. I knew that Vivian would have told him I was going to be alone for the weekend, and he decided to try his luck. But I didn't mind. I wanted to go out, but not alone, so I said yes to the date. I dressed casually and left for our date at the restaurant, which he sent me the address for. He was already there when I got there, so I apologized for keeping him waiting, and he dismissed it. Contrary to what I thought the date would be like, it was actually so much fun. I laughed so hard that at one point I started choking on my drink. Stephen gently tapped my back to calm me down while trying to hide his smile. From that date, I realized what a cool guy he was, despite his not really attractive physique. He was quite outspoken and had a good sense of humor. We started meeting more frequently, and by the time he asked me to be his girlfriend, I said yes without hesitation. I liked him a lot, and yes, he wasn't my type of guy, but he was a good guy, and I liked that about him. Vivian was the happiest when she heard I started dating her brother. She then told me how her brother had always been insecure about his looks when they were kids, and how girls would date and dump him for the fine guy. He was used most of the time for his money. In fact, she told me that he had almost gotten married once to a lady who lied that she was pregnant with his baby. She actually was pregnant with another man's baby. He had found out from a text message on her phone, which she left carelessly in the room when she had gone to take her bath. I felt bad for him, and I made up my mind not to be someone like that, and would stay loyal to him. But words are easier than the situation. The first time I cheated on Stephen was during our relationship. I didn't mean to, honestly. It wasn't even my fault. Okay, maybe it was. There was this guy called Sam. Sam was exactly my type of guy. He had a smile that could rock a woman's world, and his body looked like it was made for worshiping. No, honestly, when I saw Sam for the first time, I had tried to avoid him because I didn't want to cheat on Stephen because I liked what we had, but Sam just wouldn't leave me alone. He was all in my space. After work, he would pick me up, and on weekends, he would disturb me for a date. I couldn't tell Stephen how I was feeling because I didn't want him to think I was like the other girls, but it was so hard to resist Sam. Well, one day, Sam came to my place tipsy and told me how much he liked me and how he wanted so badly to have me in his arms, and he kissed me. I tried to resist, but despite the fact that he was tipsy, he was still stronger than me. I stopped resisting and wrapped my arms around him when Stephen entered the house. I was shocked, and he left angrily without letting me explain. I was so devastated that I sent Sam out of my house and told him never to bother me again. I think it was then he got the message, and he stopped calling or texting me. In fact, he literally vanished and wasn't anywhere around me. I tried calling Stephen and explaining, but he wouldn't pick up my calls or reply to my texts. Vivian was very mad at me and wouldn't talk to me for a week, which was very difficult for me as we worked in the same place. It was later that Vivian asked me to explain what exactly happened when I had gone to her home and pleaded with her to let me in. I told her what happened. Well, not everything. I told her about how Sam had been disturbing me and I had ignored him, but he kept trying to force his feelings on me. He had come to my house tipsy and forced himself on me, and that was when Stephen had walked in. I didn't tell her about my own feelings involved in the whole thing and how I had allowed him to pursue me without exactly telling him I had a relationship. Vivian believed me and told me she would help convince her brother that I was innocent. She did, and Stephen came back with flowers and an apology note to tell me how sorry he was for not believing my story. I was happy I got Stephen back, and we continued our relationship until, after a year, Stephen asked me to marry him, and I said yes, of course. Stephen wanted me to stop working and move into his house, and I agreed. I wasn't exactly satisfied with my job, and I've always been interested in photography, so I wanted to pursue that. Because Stephen was quite rich, I could quit my job without feeling the impact. We got married within a month, and I was just so happy. But being a housewife wasn't exactly easy for me. I mean, at first I thought it would be, and because of the fact that I loved staying at home, not running by scheduled time or looking forward to weekends when I could rest, I could do all I wanted anytime I wanted, so it was quite fun during our first 4 years of being married. But the problem started in our 5th year of marriage. My husband, who traveled a lot for work, brought home a young woman. Marcia was the maid my husband brought home to assist me with whatever I wanted. Since I never complained about the house chores or anything, I became suspicious of my husband. I mean, Marcia was a really beautiful lady, and she had all the curves in the right places. For a maid, she looked too clean and dressed really nicely. I was very suspicious, especially since Marcia had arrived. My husband traveled less, and whenever he was around, he was always having discussions with Marcia. Though the things they talked about were clearly politics or academically related, I couldn't help but suspect an underlying tone in which they spoke. I started finding faults in whatever Marcia did, and I would purposely do some things and blame her for them. She didn't mind my verbal abuse and would apologize, but that only made me more anxious and angry. I told Stephen I didn't want her around, but couldn't give a valid reason why I didn't want her. So Stephen dismissed it, but that made me more upset. I told Vivian about it, and she told me not to worry, as Stephen would never cheat on me, but I still wasn't happy. My opportunity to get rid of Marcia came when Stephen traveled, and I was able to send her away. Clearly satisfied with my actions, I waited for my husband to get home so I could lie to him about Marcia's disappearance. When he came back, I told him that Marcia had stolen my money, and when I confronted her about it, she had stood up to me, so I had to just send her away. Stephen didn't believe me and said he would look for her and confirm the truth, and that made me really angry. I snapped at him, and he eventually accepted what I said and promised not to look for her. We were happy again. Well, not exactly happy, particularly me. I wasn't happy because Stephen was always traveling and leaving me alone at home, and I didn't like that because that meant I was home alone most times, and that left me really paranoid, wondering what my husband was up to and who he was with. I didn't want to become my mother, so I told my husband that I wanted to start learning more about photography. He agreed and paid for my classes. Because I enjoyed photography so much, within months I was very good, almost as good as the teacher who taught me. So when I was confident enough in my videography and photography skills, I left to start up on my own. Stephen was so proud of me. He invested in me by giving me the needed capital to get all the necessary equipment and also a mini studio for a start. He was really helpful because he took all his pictures used for magazines, newspapers, or advertisements at my studio and would always brag to his friends and people around that I was a good photographer. Because of that, People came flocking to my studio for pictures, even celebrities. I was beginning to get contracts to work with models on certain projects like skincare, clothes, shoes, and a lot more. I was becoming so busy I barely had time for my husband anymore. You see, Stephen had a health issue. He had to cut down on his traveling and had to delegate so he wouldn't do his health more damage than he had already done. So that meant he had to stay home most of the time and only traveled if it was very important that he be there. I think maybe the near-death experience had reset his brain, and he started wanting to spend more time with me, which was difficult because I was usually busy with work. Things were reversed. I was the busy wife, and he became the stay-at-home husband. Stephen started talking about starting a family, having kids, but I refused. I was at the peak of my career, and if I ended up pregnant, I wouldn't be able to do much, and that meant I would have to cut down my workload. Eventually, when clients came several times and didn't get what they wanted, and when another photographer came into the picture, I would be out. That's what I thought. And I believed that we were still young, so there wasn't any need to rush, but Stephen kept insisting until we had a fight about it. He wanted to talk, I didn't want to, and because of that, our fight carried on for a week before we were able to sort it out. Since then, Stephen never brought up the issue of having kids again. Everything was good and fine until Cornell came into the picture. My personal assistant had advised that we get some models who would be part of my agency, and instead of the companies who brought models for their work, we would be the ones bringing the models, hence being able to charge more for our services. It was a good idea, and I accepted, and we put out an advertisement in search of models. Many models applied, but since we only needed about 4 first, that is 2 ladies and 2 guys, I did the screening myself and narrowed it down to 10 persons who were to come for interviews the next day. When they arrived the next day, it seemed difficult to choose one because they all looked good enough for the job, so I asked each of them to model for a product I'd randomly mentioned. They all did well, but in the end, I had to select the 4 best. Amongst them was Cornell. Honestly, I was biased when I chose Cornell because Cornell wasn't as good as the other guys who did the modeling interview, but I was just very interested in him. He had the physique of my dream man, and I shouldn't have even employed him in the first place, but somehow the way he stared at me during the interview made me uncomfortable, especially because I actually noticed. I shouldn't have noticed. I should have ignored his eyes that seemed to draw me into their dark, dark hole, and his sandy hair that seemed to glimmer. But I didn't, and employed him because somehow, in some way, I wanted to keep him close to me. I chose Cornell as our first model for the male underwear company we were shooting for, and that must have been the second big mistake I made. Cornell looked so good in the underwear that I almost groaned along with my personal assistant and makeup artist. They could clearly see how good he looked in it, and I had to avert my eyes from his gorgeous underwear that looked so tempting. I reminded myself that I was married and loved my husband too much to cheat on him. I repeated it several times under my breath, and it became my mantra. My hands shook so much while handling the camera for the shoot that I had to take a break from shooting, which I originally never did before. By the time I was back, I managed to finish the shoot and go home to edit the videos and pictures instead of doing it in my studio, as I always did before. When I got home, Stephen wasn't home, so I showered and settled in our dining room, eating chips and also trying to edit the videos and pictures. I was still editing the pictures, and it was taking longer than usual because I was staring at the art piece of his body and his eyes that felt like they were staring right at me when I heard a throat clearing. I jumped, obviously startled because I hadn't heard anyone come in. It turned out to be my husband, and he was asking me who I was concentrating so hard on. I didn't know he had come in, and I made excuses of being tired, but not before I had finished up with the editing, which was why I was taking so long editing one. Stephen believed me and asked me to rest up, which I agreed to do once I was done. At work, almost every morning, I started getting flowers, and they were in my favorite color, purple. At first, I thought it was my husband, but after one phone call, I discovered it wasn't him, and that made me curious as to who the secret admirer was. All this while, I was still struggling with my feelings for Cornell, and he was always flirting with me, as he did too with Amanda, my personal assistant, and the other models, which made me very jealous. But I tried not to make it obvious. I kept getting the flowers, and because I wanted to catch whoever it was, I started arriving earlier than usual for work. One day, I saw Cornell placing the flowers in front of my office door. I was surprised and called him into my office, and he was shocked I was around already. I asked why he was dropping flowers in front of my door, and he told me he just wanted to and didn't give any other valid reasons for it. It frustrated me because I had wanted to hear his confession of how he loved me and wanted me for himself. So I dismissed him, clearly disappointed that I didn't exactly hear what I wanted to. He continued putting flowers in front of my door, and this time, instead of keeping them, I trashed them. I made up my mind to try and get over the feelings I was having for him and focus on work and Steven, as I didn't want to cheat on him a second time. Well, it happened the opposite way. That day, I had dismissed everybody because I wanted to work alone and develop ideas on what to do on a particular project I got. I worked better when I was alone and not disturbed, so I was doing exactly that when Cornell came into my office. I was surprised to see him because I hadn't expected him to be there, and I asked him what the matter was. He had asked why I was throwing away his flowers, and at first I just lied that my office space was getting filled up with flowers and I had to dump them. But Cornell wouldn't buy my lie and kept insisting I tell him, and I just burst out of frustration perhaps, or maybe out of pent-up emotions that kept piling up every day from seeing him there and wanting him, and knowing it was bad because I was married and still loved my husband. But all I know is that one minute I was talking and nearly yelling at Cornell about how I felt being close to him, and the next he was kissing me, and I was kissing him back like my life depended on it. We ended up having sex in my office, on my desk. After the whole thing, then came the guilt and shame of what I had done. None of us spoke, and I just took my things and went home, knowing that Steven wasn't going to be home, but boy was I wrong. Steven was home, and he was sitting on the couch staring at the wall and just rubbing his hands together. I moved towards him, and he finally noticed me. He asked why I was so late, but I lied about working. Steven nodded, and then just excused himself and went out. I was full of anxiety and worry for Steven because he didn't come home until 2 a.m. I wasn't asleep when he walked in, clearly drunk. He was muttering some things about women and how untrustworthy they were. My heart had skipped a beat when I heard him say that, but before I could ask what he meant, he removed his clothes and slept deeply. My mind wasn't at peace because of what I did, and I just stared into the darkness until it was morning. Steven woke up, and I had gotten him a pill and water to take for his hangover cure, but he pushed my hand aside and went to take one for himself. Throughout that day, Steven didn't speak to me, just drank in excess, which he didn't ever do before. The next day after that, Steven brought home a sealed document and threw it at me. I was surprised, and when I eventually opened it, it was a divorce paper. He told me how he knew I had hired a lady to tempt him on one of his business trips. I was so ashamed to mention this earlier, but yeah, I did do that because I had thought he was cheating on me. And how he didn't fall for it and decided to test me with a model who was my exact type, and I did fall. I was shocked and started begging Steven to forgive me, but he wouldn't listen to me. He's moved out of the house and wouldn't even let me know where he's at. Please help me. I need advice on how to get Steven back. I feel so terrible for hurting him, and I want to do better this time, with a promise that I would never cheat on him ever again. Please, update. Hello Reddits, it's me again. It's so sad how before you make a stupid decision, it seems like all your life is dependent on that decision to do something that would probably eventually destroy you. I've gone and destroyed my own life and marriage with my hand. Steven doesn't ever want to hear anything except that I've signed the divorce papers, and Vivian hates me so much now that she deleted my number off her phone and refuses to speak to me too. The one place I had come to, hoping I'd get some sort of advice that could help me, I got no support at all, and everyone seems to hate me here too. I feel so terrible because I fell for a guy all because he was my type and my husband isn't. I regret everything I did from the first time I cheated on him to the second time too. I feel so disgusted with myself. I'm unhappy and so sad. I can barely even go to work these days because I can't seem to concentrate. I had everything I could ever want, and yet my insatiable, stupid self ended up ruining my one chance at happiness. I feel like every time I look in the mirror, all I see are my mistakes, and I feel so irritated by the image of myself. I have no one to talk to, and all I can do is beat myself up over what I did. I cannot even forgive myself, and I know I'll forever live with this mistake of losing my own marriage because I had a type. It kills me every day, knowing I will forever wake up to an empty other side of the bed. I wish I had the chance to correct my wrongs and never have slept with Cornell that day, or even employed him at all. I wouldn't be in all these problems if I hadn't listened to my lust-filled brain. I feel so bad for helping Cornell do his job so well and easily by falling into his trap. Now I've lost Stephen and Vivian too, all because I was being led by my desires for a certain type of men. These days, when I even walk past my so-called type of men, I don't even see them. They don't look attractive to me anymore. I feel so doomed.
Update.
Hello Reddits, this is my last post here, and I just wanted to say how grateful I am to be able to tell my story here and have people read it. Despite the negative comments that made me feel worse than I already felt, at least I was able to tell my story. I still regret a lot of things, and know that I will never recover from my mistake of losing Stephen. I've been wishing a lot these days. Things I wish I did do, and things I wish I never did. I'm so unhappy and sad with how I've ended, and I just want to say to you all, never ever think it wise to cheat on your partner, married or not, because it might end up causing you more harm than even your partner. Thanks and goodbye.